Welcome back to UWM Urban Spelunking, a series covering historic buildings and locations on the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee's campus. Today we'll be talking to Thomas Haigh, who manages the UWM History Department's Retrocomputing Lab, which holds a growing collection of fully functional personal computer hardware from every decade. Students can visit by appointment or during open house sessions, which are announced on their mailing list.
My research is about the history of computing in different ways from different perspectives. Business history, labor history, technological history, history of computer science. And I'm writing a book on the history of AI. And teaching, I teach about the history of race and health and the graduate research methods class, but also I teach about every year to 18 months, I teach a class in the Honors College, which is the seminar on how the computer became universal. And that's based on my book here, A New History of Modern Computing, which is a big fat book. It's got the whole history of computing from ENIAC in World War II, the first programmable electronic computer, through to the pandemic era. So that is the basis of the course, along with a bunch of other readings. But one of the things that became apparent to me was that current undergraduates don't have a lot of historical memory of computing that goes back particularly far for obvious reasons. So, in the history of computing, we've known for a long time that if you're talking about different kinds of mainframe computer from the 50s and 60s, that's going to need a lot of explaining to ordinary people. But what's true now is that you can't assume anymore that people know the difference between an IBM PC and an Apple Mac, or different generations of computers, or what a home computer was, or what it was like to program in BASIC, or any of those things. So to make the course more accessible to students, even during the pandemic, when I was working on the book, I found it valuable to have hands-on experience with some of the earlier computers to complement what I remembered and what I found in printed sources. The Apple II, for example, is a really important computer in the US, which I'd never used personally. So I started building up a bit of a collection in my attic during the pandemic, and then teaching the class for the first time, I was able to move that into this space here at the top of Holton Hall as the UWM History Department RetroLab. So that's a space where students are able to come, somewhat more viably than coming up to my attic, which would sound a little unsavory, and see and use the computers a little bit during some of the class meetings, and also work on their individual projects where they pick a topic of particular interest and use the lab resources to research a paper on that topic. Well, as a student, I was interested in history. I was also interested in computer science. In the British system, you go to university usually for 3 years and you study only one topic, so you have to choose one or the other. But then after doing my first 2 degrees in computer science, I was able to do my PhD essentially in the history of technology. So that was a chance to combine the interests. I've been here since 2004. The first 13 years were in the School of Information Studies. That was not a particularly great place for me because, they aren't very interested in history, so I wasn't teaching anything historical. But in addition, they viewed computing as something for the more vocational undergraduate kind of course, so they also weren't kind of particularly interested in computing. So I was pleased when I had a chance to transfer to the history department about 7 years ago, and that's obviously all my teaching here is historical, and some of the time, as with this seminar, I'm also able to use the lab resources to teach students about the history of computing. Pretty much for what I described, right? There's a range. You'll see there's not a whole bunch of computers that are the same. So there's more that you're not seeing, that's in storage and in a kind of closet. But we've got room here to keep out a selection of desktop computer systems from about 1980 to the early 2000s. It can't try and be a complete collection of every kind of Mac, every kind of PC, but the idea is that they're spaced a few years apart from each other in the main computing families. So you've got examples of all the main computer platforms in personal computing from that era. If someone comes in and they want to experience a program on something similar to the hardware that would have been in use at the time it was released, then we can match that, plus or minus 18 months, and they can have something pretty close to the original experience. So it's not intended to be a comprehensive collection or a museum exhibit. The idea here is that if somebody wants to recreate a period experience using a particular piece of software, we've got something that is close enough to let them have that authentic experience with it. I mean, if you look around, right, how many have we got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So we've got 16 out on the desks at the moment. Then we've probably got at least that many laptops in those bags there. And we've probably got another 15 or so in the closet, which I've taken out and tested and found to be at least partly working. Some of them are just not out because there's no room for them at the moment, or some of them need some maintenance that we haven't got around to doing yet. So you add all that together, there's probably about maybe 50, 60 functional computers in the lab, and a few more that need repairing or are just here for spare parts. So this is from the era where IBM PC compatibles had pretty much broken away from IBM, and there were relative companies that were pretty much building on demand with whatever components were giving good price performance from Taiwan that month. So when you ordered a computer, they'd put it together just for you with a specific configuration of graphics card and hard drive and processor and so on. This is from the first era where CD-ROMs and sound cards and speakers were standard parts of PCs. So this is Windows 3.1. The Windows 3 family was the first widely used Windows. But it's fun because when you go to Windows 95, there's a start button in the corner. It's kind of actually not that different from the Windows that people use now. But Windows 3 had a completely different way of doing it with this program manager and icon groups to start programs. And there's no start menu. The buttons are all different and so on. So people often like the experience. If they were around in that period, it's often very nostalgic for them. But if they're the students, they're like, this is weird. This is kind of Windows, but it is like acting very strangely. And this is something that I mentioned in the book. So it's still a kind of fun game. Sometimes I kill time with it while students are doing their projects. The solitaire game that was bundled with Windows. So at the time, people would have been using IBM compatible PCs primarily with the MS-DOS, with programs like WordPerfect and Lotus 123 that were pretty much text-based. And Microsoft wanted to get people over to the graphical environment using a mouse, and this experience that is very similar to what Apple pioneered with the Macintosh. So the solitaire game is actually it's beautifully designed. The students read about the graphic designer Susan Kare, who did work with Apple on a freelance basis for Mac Paint and some other things, and then worked with Windows on the design of the card decks and the icons and so on, which is why Windows 3 actually has got some really nicely designed little icons. So that's an example for the students. They get to see this kind of part of computer history they probably never thought about, like, so where do the icons come from? And they've got a reading that kind of puts a human behind that in an unexpected way. So Microsoft wanted you to get the hang of doing basic mouse operations like drag and drop and double clicking. So instead of a tutorial, they put the solitaire game there. And in the early 90s, when Windows 3 became popular, you would just see a lot of people in offices just sitting around playing solitaire instead of whatever they were supposed to be doing. But it was obviously successful in that respect because people got familiar with the mouse and with the basic conventions of the graphical user interface. So you can have experience with DOS. Pretty much every major version of Windows is running on one of these computers. So if a student wants to do a project on the history of Windows, they can experience that on that hardware. Got the games consoles in this corner. So they're not all out, but we've got a PS1, a Nintendo 64, a Super Nintendo, and Sega Genesis with some selections of games. And a Laserdisc player, which came from surplus, but I had to buy a couple discs of my own on eBay. So we've got the Empire Strikes Back, which is pretty fun. And I also, surplus didn't have the remote control, so I had to buy that one on eBay. It's a ridiculously large remote that goes with the, I guess, gigantic size of the discs. This side here is where the Macintoshes are concentrated. So this is in the same basic format as the original Mac. So Macs are interesting because they have a very small, crisp display, which is quite different from the PCs of the era. I think students just read about that. They don't quite get the sense of how different that was. So with this, they're able to come and use it. Couple later Macs there. This is actually one of my favorites, the Mac 2CI. And we've got one more Mac there in the corner, the second generation of iMac, which has the desk lamp kind of look. And then this area here are the older 8-bit computers. So the Apple IIe is a classic. This computer is running CP/M, and it's not directly driving a display. It's working with this terminal, which came from surplus, actually. It probably used to, I'm guessing it used to be in the library or somewhere like that to access the card catalog. And we've got a couple British home and personal computers, the BBC Micro and the Sinclair Spectrum. So this is the 8-bit corner. And then we've also got the Atari ST here, which is a more powerful home computer from the mid to late 1980s. So the idea is these machines that are kind of permanently out on the desks give a pretty representative slice through the history of personal computing in those 2 decades. Yeah, this is the Atari VCS, originally released in the mid-1970s, the first popular cartridge-based home console system. Plugged into a TV. Original capabilities were very basic, but towards the end of the lifespan, programmers found very ingenious ways to run games like Pitfall here, which go far beyond what the hardware was originally designed for. You'll also notice there's a consistent late 70s wood grain aesthetic, so this would have fitted nicely in a wood paneled basement. And then, so it came with this little storage area here. And you can see those systems there are kind of all labeled. I think they're all working to some extent. Some of them work completely, and I just don't have space for them. They're not particularly different from what's out. Others of them need a bit of work. And that tub there is my tub of broken things that I can like pass around and let the students handle to just see what the technology looked like.
Yes, so my name is Brian Schmidt. I am expected to graduate in 2027. And right now, I am using Integer Basic in the Retrocomputing Lab for one of my assignments. And then here, we have a little bit of what I've been working on. So I have made a very simple program that takes a number and then counts it to 5. And for each increment, it tabs what it's saying here. And that is the gist of what I'm doing over here.
All right. And what class is this for?
This is for an honor seminar class on how the computer has become universal.
Why did you decide to take this class?
I decided to take this class because I've always really been interested in computers. And so I figured learning more about the history of computers, but make me appreciate more of what I use on a day-to-day basis because of how integrated computers are into our life. And then also, since I am doing the computer science major, I figured stuff like this would very much give me the appreciation I have for the programming stuff we are learning in our classes. So even though I have gripes with the languages and such that we are using, I can know where it's come from and realize the improvements we've made and maybe what constraints have even stayed through time.
There's a variety. Some of them were mine when I was growing up, and fortunately been kept in my parents' attic. Some of them I purchased. Many of them are donated by members of the history department faculty or by people in the area who heard about the lab and were kind enough to go into their attics and basements and pull out whatever they had and provide me with them. So the names from the people who donated things are on the website. And also at this point, when the university IT people, for example, were clearing out the chemistry department and they find anything that looks old or weird in a closet, they tend to put it on one side and ask me if I want it. So some of the machines here also have come from UWM. Yeah, I mean, surplus is great. It's reached a point now a little bit more where when the IT people find something, they might put it on one side for me rather than send it to surplus. But for example, when I first set the lab up, some of these systems were set up with LCD screens, the flat panels, which was not historically accurate. And a large proportion of the old school monitors that you see around here came from surplus. So did that Macintosh SE there, and a number of the weird little peripherals. So sometimes students would have a project to work, say, on the history of accessibility devices for disabled people, or weird kind of mouse replacements and so on. And I've got some of that hardware on the shelves, and most of that stuff came from surplus. So yeah, I'd say surplus has been a great resource for the lab, and I always enjoy going there and grabbing things. Unfortunately, it's got a bit full now, so I've not been doing that as often as I previously did. But yeah, other little things like the boxes to keep floppy disks in, that kind of thing, often finish up in surplus. And some media things as well. So I've got an 8-track there and a CD player and so on. And as those were getting ripped out of various classrooms and finishing up in surplus, some of the students also have interest that crosses over with older media formats. And that's been particularly helpful to have the stuff from surplus for that. Everything that's out is working, and there's often a period of initial work that's necessary. So a few of the computers basically just work straight off, but mostly, for example, all the Macintoshes have an elaborate floppy disk drive mechanism that needs to be stripped down and cleaned out and lubricated. So I don't think I've had any Macintoshes with floppy drives come in and have the drives actually work. Some of them have got keys that don't work, or they need a little bit of maintenance to function at all. And I can do kind of basic things like that. Some of them also, the computers from a certain era, which is mostly the early to mid-90s, have got capacitors that tend to go bad and leak. So some of the machines from that era have needed to have capacitors replaced in order to function reliably. So with every specific machine, sometimes the hard drives have failed and I need to fit a new hard drive and reinstall software on it. Although it's always nicer if the drive is still working, because then you can have a snapshot of how the machine was set up during the time that it was in use. So I think looking around the lab, the specific thing that's needed to be done to every computer is probably a little bit different, but they've all needed some kind of restoration to be fully functional. Once they're working, hopefully they stay working. being turned on is actually better for them than being left turned off. But I do, for example, there was one computer where one day I turned it on and the floppy drive had failed. Unfortunately, I was able to find a replacement from the stash of spare parts. Floppy disks tend to go bad. Sometimes I want to demonstrate something for the student and a disk that I made a few years earlier has failed and needs to be recreated. So those are examples of the kind of routine maintenance that's needed even after the computers are made operational. Okay, one of the things I've learned is a surprisingly large number of issues with non-functional old things can be solved with deoxit spray. So you don't think of computers as going rusty, but on a small kind of level they do, and sometimes the corrosion isn't even visible. But there's been a surprising number of places where I've had a computer or a graphics card or something like that doesn't work, and I find that spraying the connectors with deoxit, taking the chips out, spraying the little legs of the silicon chips, putting them back in, and then using some rubbing alcohol on a Q-tip has restored a surprising number of things to life. So I'd say don't underestimate the rust, the literal rusting of computers and the power of the deoxit spray. Another thing I've learned is that the academic history of computing community has grown a lot over the 25 years that I've been associated with it. But the community of amateurs who are watching YouTube videos about how to fix old Commodore computers or are showing up at the Midwest Vintage Computer Festival is much larger. And while many of those people are strictly there for the nostalgia, and recreating the experiences of their youth, or collecting in the same kind of way you might collect Elvis memorabilia, if you're from a slightly older generation. I think there is real potential for the academic side of the history of computing to engage more with the retro computing enthusiast community. So that's something I have a little bit with the lab. There are some students who are not taking the course but are interested in the topic and sometimes come in to help out with restoring the machines, or the student chapter of the IEEE Computer Society tends to visit once a semester and maybe have what's essentially an end of semester party here, playing with some of the older video games and so on. So I think the lab has been a good way of me learning more about those kinds of communities and making some of those connections. And in my own research, there is, for example, even in the book, there are a few passages about what's it like to actually use the computers, where describing the experience of the thing turning on and beeping and grinding its disks, or what the keyboard felt like, or being able to pull out the graphics card for an IBM PC and compare it to the Apple IIe motherboard, because I had those things in front of me, helps to inform my research and give readers a little bit more of a sense of what it was like to engage with the material reality of the computers.
Thank you for watching UWM Urban Spelunking. Earlier, Thomas Haigh mentioned that much of the hardware in the RetroLab comes from the UWM Surplus program. In the next episode, we will get the opportunity to visit the Surplus warehouse and interview their staff.